How did you go do it?
Awesome. All right. Hello. All right, so listen, let's get started. Let me hand around the famous sign-in sheet. I'll fill in the top. Don't worry, I came prepared.
I know you didn't put mine from last week. I know, but this you gotta start class off right.
Listen now.
You gotta start class off right now. You can. Let's check out your last name, man.
Actually, it's Trico Moxie,
Trico Moxie.
but either is
one.
fine.
Okay. She's start class off right. You can make any classes. Okay. All right. I owe you some from last weekend. Yes. Hey, can I
Oh,
look? Can
y'all
I
think I owe him some from last week?
I don't think so. I mean, unless you share and something.
But you invite to share, you didn't give me a chance to get together.
Yeah, you deserve it. You deserve it. 'Cause you rolling for real.
You can take it.
All right.
Oh!
Hi, yay! Hi!
I want to smack up.
Why did they write this there? Okay, yeah.
It's fine. I won't be bad. Then I take it.
No, sorry.
All right. So, I read over your little assignment that's coming up. And quite a bit of what we're gonna do today needs to get covered, and you guys answer your question.
All right?
So I will hint at things as we go through that you guys need to consider in answering your assignment.
When you say we should consider, is that the hint?
Blatant hint?
Like, right, it's just like a, like, it's an undercover type
But they
hint
say,
or
they
like
say,
right there?
they say
Now you're gonna
GRC.
negotiate with me.
Yeah. But they say GRC, you're supposed to be very precise, not like AML, you belong. So you have to be precise with the answer.
You guys will get the hint, trust me.
Oh, okay.
All right. Cool. So, one of the things I asked y'all to do, I gave you also a little bit of homework. Everybody remember what the question was?
Look in the proceeds of crime after the audits.
Yes, where you have to give up client information. So, who's gonna tell me what those what those orders are that they can? Now let me make sure I'm clear on this now. The FIU is gonna go through the HG's office, or the police can actually seek to get the order from the court. Okay? So, that being said, what are the orders in the Proceeds of Crime Act 2018 to the Bahamas, whereby your institution may have to give up client information?
Restraining order.
A what?
Restraining a production order.
Well, one of them, production order, what else?
See, if I say production order, what production?
Okay,
Disclosure. Production, disclosure, customer.
disclosure.
Order. I think monitoring, I don't know.
Yes, monitoring might be one of those. Why? Because in the monitoring order, they are asking for information on a particular person with regard to maybe a number of transactions,
Yeah, start.
right? And then they have an actual customer information order,
Right.
right?
Disclosure.
And whilst this may be not willing, but under the search and seizure orders, you may find that customer information may end up being obtained by the authorities, correct? That's not to say that that's all the orders that you could get under the Proceeds of Crime Act. Just for your edification, there are the unlawful conduct orders, and there's the unexplained wealth orders. That's one that I'm looking forward to see how it actually is applied and used here. When I spoke to, I think his name, I think he's Sergeant, he might be Inspector, I'm not sure, Turnquest. He's a young guy, is he Sergeant? Tall, bright-skinned guy? Okay. He's part of the new unit that's on Nassau Street. that all of you guys should become familiar with. They are the new unit that actually has a combination of what we knew as the commercial crimes unit. They would be the units that are looking at breaches of, information technology. There's a special group that is now housed off Nassau Street, and their job is really to deal with these sort of matters. Most of you probably even pass their building and don't even know that you pass it. Yeah, I know I was passing and didn't know. But one of the things I know with the unexplained wealth orders, they have already started to use these in the UK. You can find a lot of information online on how they're being used. Under the Proceeds of Crime Act, remember, if you cannot explain how you acquired your wealth, it's deemed to be unexplained wealth, for which the assets could be seized. So it's going to be interesting. Yes, you can try and get it back. You have to prove that, obviously, if it has been seized, that you can show legitimately how you got these funds.
But you were trying to in the first instance.
One would hope, right? One would hope.
Boy, that's a slippery slope.
It is a slippery slope. Obviously, the legal minds, we're looking to see how it actually works in practice in the UK. I'm straying a little bit. In the UK, for example, recently, there was a gentleman who, he was the CEO of a bank in Azerbaijan. And obviously, a large majority of the bank's customers were defrauded, and in the authorities trying to get the assets, or at least the funds, back to reimburse the customers, they realized that the CEO, who was involved in the whole scam that was going on in this bank, he had unexplained wealth. Now, unexplained wealth, then they look at how much he would have been paid on an average basis as a CEO, whether or not he happened to have gotten any inheritance, won the lotto, how much was he putting in on his tax returns, that sort of thing. And anything that couldn't fall into those categories is deemed to be unexplained wealth. So when they looked at what his wife was spending off of his account, for example, she was going into Harrods and spending millions. All right, and obviously the authorities went to Harrods and they could track what she'd been purchasing. And one instance, they're actually auctioning off a ring that they were able to seize that's worth $1 million that she bought at Harrods. So that's why I said it's going to be interesting to see how the unexplained wealth orders are actually being used here. Okay?
I mean, the reason why I say it's interesting is because, I guess, clearly the state really have to do their research.
Yes.
Because if you see somebody's stuff unexplained, and they can turn around and explain it, could they turn around and sue? Not mistaken.
Well, the legislation provides for you to get the assets back. It's just that you're going to have to show, the onus is upon you to prove the innocence, in essence. That is how it works.
I heard you that's the affirmation of my
It's
character.
always, but they would argue, the argument is, and this is where jurisprudence is gonna come in, and you're gonna see how actually, okay, then.
Yeah, new strike.
It's going to be interesting to see, whether, they've gone beyond their powers. Is it a breach of your civil rights in some way under your fundamental rights under our Constitution, that kind of stuff. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
So a lot of the lawyers out there, we're interested to see how this is actually going to play out, and how the courts will really be the true arbitrators over whether or not they feel that, this is truly something that is fair and doesn't go beyond the powers. So we'll see. Hey, they say watch this space. Watch this space with unexplained wealth orders. But yes, those are the orders that unfortunately clients' information can be turned over by a financial institution. Okay? Now, that's going to be interesting because we're going to be moving on into data protection and how the compliance role falls into ensuring that clients' information is actually protected within your organization. Like I said, the job of the compliance officer is never done. All right? So last week we talked about a lot of the things or attributes that a compliance officer needs to have. We went, half of y'all walk out on me, but that's all right. I know y'all read the chapter.
Child.
I said, oh, what was you here?
You see that, eh?
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So you would, when you read, if you read through the chapter, and I'm hoping I'm 176. So you guys must be 175.
What data protection?
Technical knowledge.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah, 176.
Right. So first we talked about some of the personal attributes that the compliance officer needed. That's just a recap. And I actually spoke about, I think it was 7.
If you print it in a section, you print the whole line.
Give me just a second, because my brain is kind of foggy this afternoon. Yes, I talked about, actually, I have 7. Although I think there may have been 8. But there was at least 7 that this unit actually breaks down. And remember what they were. Some of the skills were interpersonal skills. The compliance officer have to have. You just let the police go by. Okay, so interpersonal skills, you gotta have to be able to communicate, that's verbally and in writing. We talked about the ability to lead and manage, the ability to influence and facilitate, IT skills, the ability to assimilate knowledge quickly, and the technical knowledge. And you gotta be able to manage all of this. Right? My young man here from First Caribbean, remember, he told me about, so how are we going to convince our directors to come to the training and actually absorb what we're actually imparting? That's where your dynamic personality is going to come out. Correct? Awesome. And then the technical knowledge, just in case you didn't have all those personal skills. You will notice that there is a list there. And notice when I say a list of the technical knowledge that you will need. And a lot of that has to do with the business acumen, understanding your business, right? Knowing the regulatory environment, knowing the legislation and laws that apply to the functions within your institution. Right? And that's only some of them. Gee, look at the rest of this. They have everything here to, at a minimum, did you see the way they say at a minimum, you must show good knowledge of the following topics. So I don't know about too many other jobs that need all of these abilities and skill sets. And every year, there's a few more added. All right? So, I won't go through all of them. One of them, obviously, is to keep abreast of different changes. I actually have bookmarked the Wolfberg website, FATF website, OEC website, every website that all my regulators. So that if something new comes up, I will get notification. So I will go and look. So for example, this week, the Wolfberg group put out a whole paper on sanctions. How should you be screening? What should you be looking for? particularly in light of persons like me, who got a nice note from the Securities Commission to tell me that I have now to put out an annual sanctions declaration to them before a particular date. Now, I don't know about you, right? But I get the gazetted legislation. But as we all know, by the time government publication sends that out, it's some time after the legislation has been gazetted. So they have the UN orders as resolutions have been placed into orders on Iraq and Afghanistan. And there in that bottom paragraph, last paragraph, at the end of the order, it says, you have to make an annual declaration. I'm like, well, geez, if the Securities Commission, obviously they realized that most of us didn't get the order yet. So they were kind enough to put it on their site and kind enough to send us all a little note to say that we needed to hand in or submit our annual sanctions declaration yesterday. So this is why you need to bookmark those things, make sure that they are pinging you to let you know that there are changes that are happening. All right? But that's just my little, please note this as you go about your function. These will be important to you as you continue along. So when under the technical skills, they go into analytical skills and research skills. The research skills doesn't mean going through the legislation or the regulations or whatever other material is out there like FATF. It means that you're also going to have, remember those IT skills we're talking about? You're going to be able to have to go into a system, use the different, what do you call it, intellectual databases, which are really like things like Google and Bing and the rest of these. And how do you manipulate those and other government sites that may be free that you can check on information about the person who's coming to your institution. It's not easy to go in and figure out how to do these things, but you have to learn and how to filter out the information that isn't viable for you. That was a big challenge for me, coming into compliance. All right, and there are a lot of seminars that deal with those type of things. And they'll tell you how to put in certain words and put them in quotations and all sorts of things like that in order to help you. But that's what they mean by you're going to have the research skills. You have to know about the sites that you can go to, government sites in different jurisdictions that will give you free information. And some of them, your organization, as part of your compliance budget, you're going to have to budget for. You may have to pay for it. Things like sites like Factiva, for example, if you don't know what you're doing, that will give you millions of hits. And you're like, wait a minute, I have to go through all of this stuff? You have to know how to search in order to get the right information out. Because junk in brings junk out, right? So that's part of that investigative and analytical skills that they have here that, unfortunately, compliance officers need to also exude. All right? And then we talked about, you see they talk about business awareness and pragmatism. Really, they want you to understand your markets and work with the business. We're not the business blockers, as most of the salespeople think we are. We're the ones who have to understand some of the challenges that are out there, not only in relation to marketing the product, but actually implementing the product. And like we talked before, a lot of this is repetitive. Understanding the risks that go with the product as you introduce it. And then working with the sales team or whichever team it is to create that balance for your organization. Not to say, no, we can't do it, but there are ways to do everything once you're prepared to take certain risks. And if you understand the risks And if you understand the products, you can suggest things. This is where we have to be quick in thinking, quick in our analytical skills. Understanding how we can put things in place to assist with that product being implemented in our organization. Okay? And so that's what they're talking about under the heading Business Awareness and Pragmatism. We can't work in isolation. We have to understand and have to be able to be solution orientated. We can't say no to everything. I mean, they already expect we're going to say no to everything. They're always surprised when we say, well, maybe this is an alternative solution that you might consider. So, you gotta love compliance. Then they talk about some other skills. We talked about this a bit too. Like here again, I don't know about y'all, but gee, I was really tired with some of the stuff. They keep repeating it. But unfortunately, it's very repetitive because they speak about different things in different ways. Just because compliance is one of those functions that we have to know all things. You know? So they talk about your listening skills. And listening might mean that you just have to sit there and just hear them out first and interject, maybe force, I said you be forceful but not abrasive in how you do it is the best way to talk about that. And you gotta have negotiation skills. And they talk about all of this, they go into it. A lot of this I've already mentioned, so I won't bore you all tonight with going into it again. How about that? If you've read it, you can pick up a lot of things we talked about in communication. They want you to be able to clearly articulate your topic. You have to be able to verbally convince somebody to do something other than what they want to do. In writing, you have to be able to do the same thing. And that might mean that you could break something down to its simplest. Because guess what? If you're explaining something and you're explaining it up here, which is in generally most times where we are. When we're working with the business functions and we start explaining and they don't have a clue what you're talking about. You have to break that down in the simplest of language so that not only do you get them to understand, but you get them to comply. Right? And then all the things we talked about, when you're able to do those type of things, and you get them to comply, you get them to come to you first. That's always the thing that you want in compliance. Come to me first. Don't go and do it and then come to me. Come to me first. Then we'll talk about how you can do it. Okay? Or if not to do it.
So, come first.
Come first. And remember I talked about compliance can't work in isolation. You can't work in a little cubicle in the back and have a closed door principle. No, you have to have an open door principle. You have to make people feel comfortable enough to want to come to you. And I can definitely tell you from my own experience that unless you do that, you will never get your compliance program in your organization to be where you want it to be. All right? And I learned that when I first came in to compliance. Like I told you guys, I don't know if you remember, I fell into compliance. When I went to Credit Suisse from practice, I did not intend to go into compliance, didn't know anything about compliance. I went in as their in-house, and as different things happened. We didn't have a compliance officer because he left, and guess who got appointed to job? And why did I get appointed to job? Well, you're an attorney, so you already know the laws and everything else, so you'll know what to do. No, I don't. So I had a steep learning curve. It was interesting. It was a different environment. That was before the 2000 legislation that we got. Before we got blacklisted how many times. It's totally different. But with that, you're going to, remember now, as compliance officers, you're going to make mistakes, and then you have to learn from them. All right? And I say that because, like I said, I didn't appreciate that. I have to have that open door policy. I have to have that ability to draw people to me, as opposed to having them go and do something and then say, oh, by the way. All right? And I had to learn a lot of patience. So, with that, I will tell you, patience was never one of my strong points. So, this has been, compliance has been a learning experience on many levels for me. Okay? So, one of the other things that they talk about too is presentation skills. We went through this already. Training, presentation, how are you gonna train? Remember what some of the things I already told y'all? I got my little bag of stuff here. Actually, there's a couple people who did actually mention some of the orders. My friend back here. You want another quiz?
That was last week though. Just so confident to me. I like Snickers though. It's like that. Yes, thank
Who
you.
else put up their hand? Who gave me an answer? Anyone else? No takers, okay. Cool. All right, yes, share with the person next to you, please. All right? So remember presentation skills. I talked about putting things up that people remember, making it fun, bringing it down to its simplest. When I did the 2018 legislation, that was the Proceeds of Crime Act, and the Financial Transaction Reporting Act and regs. First of all, we deal with legislative updates, so I already lose them right when they hear that. But I had to make it fun. And when I tested them, I had nobody fail. Because there you go. You got to be effective in how you train and and how you are using those skills, all those skills that you got to have to get people to buy in. All right? So
let's say if you let's say you have a huge, a small compliance department.
Mhm.
You have a huge company that's a lot of people, and you don't have the resources, I guess for people to say resources to ensure everyone is effectively trained, because you don't have enough time in the day to get this training done. Like what will be a suggestion with that?
my suggestion is you have to report to your board. Your board, we're going to go into this, right? Part of governance, risk, and compliance is that they can't say, one, they didn't know that you can't get to all these people because you lack the resources. And they didn't do anything about it because they didn't know. Those days are gone. You can't put your head on, be an ostrich, put your head in the sand. That's just not going to be acceptable by your regulator. All right? And basically, you have to have that direct line. Shh. You gotta have a direct line. Compliance has to have a direct line to the board. Internal audit is another one of those functions that has to have a direct line to the board. In my organization, my direct line is actually to the independent director as well as to the board generally. But she's the person that I go to. All right, and she happens to, the great thing for me is that she has been in the financial services for years. And I can even run things by her, and she can help me to think how best I'm going to deal with a situation. All right? And so there should be somebody on your board who has that skill. If not, that person that you could go to and will step in for you to help support you when you go to the board and say, look, I am seriously underfunded. And in order for us to meet our regulatory requirements, this is what I need. Now, remember one of the things I talked about last week is being able to, when you're gonna have to submit a report to your board, and your report is going to have to succinctly say what it is, what are the risks if you're not funded properly so that you can do the training that's needed. And so guess what, if they say no, see this here, it's covered. all right? And one of the things that you have to remember now with the new inspector, I don't know if I can still call him new, but the inspector, his implementation of new processes now is that once a year, the central bank will meet with the compliance officer and internal audit to discuss the things in your organization that may be of concern not only to your organization, but as a knock-on effect to the jurisdiction at large. All right, now, I think I indicated we don't have any whistleblowing legislation, but there's sufficient, some would argue there is sufficient protection for us. I don't know, but if you could take on this job, you're gonna have to be a person of strong integrity. And if you can't do that, then you might as well get out. I'm letting you know that now. All right, there have been plenty of times in organizations where they told me, you know, and one I got fired too. That's okay. At the end of the day, I left with my integrity intact, and guess what? They were the ones who got written up by the regulator, not me. You understand? And what will happen in most cases, you'll find too, that when a compliance officer gets fired, the first thing the regulator is going to do is to go and find that compliance officer.
Yeah.
Because they want to know, why did you get fired? So technically, as a compliance officer, you're in a pretty good position if you think about it. So don't be scared to say what needs to be said is really the words that I want to impart to you. All right?
Right now, we're having like mandatory exit interviews, the compliance officer.
Yes,
That was lacking, in previous years.
it was.
They would either leave or resign or got fired, like you said. But now they're having like mandatory exit interviews, even if the person left on their own accord. They're going
Yes.
somewhere else.
They need to understand why. Because even if a person leaves, in most cases they may have left because they're just frustrated. They've tried to make the changes and do what needs to be done, and they've been blocked. And so, you only could deal with that for so long. And if another opportunity comes up, then you know what you're going to say. Well, too bad to this ship. I'm going to the next one. All right? And so the regulator realizes, particularly since, I think I also mentioned last week in our CFATF evaluation, one of the things that we got written up for was the fact that there wasn't sufficient regulatory oversight. All right, and that is, so for example, sorry, I forgot your name. Sorry? Teresa said, the fact is that on the exit meeting of your inspection, are you speaking with the compliance officer? One of the other things, like I said, the central bank meeting and having that dialogue with the compliance officer and internal audit on that regular basis in order to appreciate what is the risk in the jurisdictions and to a particular licensee, for example. All right? And no, the Bahamas isn't unique. This is happening all over the world. I know a lot of people say it's only happening in the Bahamas. No, it's not. We just now experiencing what a lot of other jurisdictions have been experiencing for a number of years. Okay? So, we got far from presentation and training skills. But one of the other things that they talk about in some of the personal skills and quality is project management. Every project that your organization have, I don't care if you're a bank, if you're an insurance company, if you're a law firm, whatever, whoever that person is, that project is going to end up on your desk. That's the reality of the situation. And why is that? Because they think that everything is compliance oriented. And whilst you'll see in governance, risk, and compliance that the compliance function is to help the board appreciate the risk, create the framework for your organization, and help to monitor and control the risk, right? But that doesn't mean that we have to do everything. There are other departments. They know how to do these things. Set up a committee with everybody. That just means the compliance officer will be on every committee. That's usually what ends up happening, right? But even part of governance, risk, and compliance, as we're going to talk about too. the board has to, no longer can the board say it doesn't know. And so it has to set up board committees. And these board committees have to be able to understand completely what is happening in your organization. Because like we said, you cannot say as a board, you did not know. And as a result of our new Financial Transaction Reporting Act, I'm just trying to remember, I think I take the section, hold on. But the act actually talks about, under the offenses, under the Financial Transaction Reporting Act. And I will have to find it. I'm thinking, is it 30? I don't have it off my head right now, but I can tell you in a gist what it says. Basically, it really says that companies can now commit an offense, right? So your organization commits the offense, but guess who's going to be responsible for it? The directors and all those persons within your organization who was involved in the offense. So that includes managers, agents, and they're making sure that it is very clear those persons who are going to be responsible. And I actually have I don't have the exact section, but here's what it says. It says a transaction is conducted or sought to be conducted through the financial institution, and it has reasonable grounds to suspect that the transaction or the proposed transaction is or may be relevant to the enforcement of the Proceeds of Crime Act or the Financial Transaction Reporting Act. And you fail to report the transaction, for example, that's even with regard to suspicious transaction, then who commits the offense? The financial institution, and that includes, and it specifically says that includes the managers, directors, employee, or agent of the financial institution. All right? So, and then it goes on to say, because it talks about the specific liability, right? The only way that you could get out of it, right? You actually have to show that you didn't have personal knowledge or authority. You didn't give permission or consent, and that consent is either expressed or implied to the act that amounts to the offense.
Which act is that?
It's the Financial Transaction Reporting Act. And I should also tell you that those acts bind the Crown, both of them. This is at the back, just in case. So what does that mean? Yes. Government, quasi-government organizations, the legislation applies to you too. Can't say you didn't know, can't say it doesn't apply. Unfortunately, we went far enough to say it binds the Crown. All right? I wish, I was trying to get the actual section. I think it's 55 under the Financial Transaction Reporting Act. I think it's part, I'm looking here, it's part 6, miscellaneous. It talks about directors and officers of body corporate. That's where it actually talks about you being held liable. And then there, some of the offenses, there's one in particular, and I thought it was 30-something, but I think I'm wrong. 20, so, I will have to look for it for you. I usually have this stuff highlighted, but it actually goes on to, I mean, it specifically says who are going to be responsible. Like I said to y'all, I don't like to be on the speeding bus. And fines now under the Financial Transaction Reporting Act, Proceeds of Crime Act, and the time spent in our love at Her Majesty's pleasure has gone up from 10, like 2, it was like usually 2 to 7, now we're at 10 to 20 years. I don't know about you, but that's a long time. Okay? A long time to be in jail. And I don't have, fines are up to 500,000. Hello? Even if I sell my house, I wouldn't make that. You understand? So it's cheaper, I stay out of trouble. All right, so bear in mind, you know, these are things that we all have to adhere to. But part of project management is being able to bring people together, understanding the risk, set out what the risks are, determine how we can control the risk. Went through this before, you see it's repetitive. And then putting the policies and procedures in place, in writing, and just leave it out there and say, oh, everybody verbally knew. You didn't know, you gotta put it in writing. And all of those policies have to be approved by who? The board. Because they can't say they weren't aware and they didn't approve this. They may say, okay, well, maybe you need to make a slight change, and they may have something to add that could help to boost what you've already put there, which would be great. But it has to be approved by the board, and you have to be able to show that they have been approved by the board. When Central Bank comes in for me, they want to see the resolution that approves every policy, procedure, manual, everything. So the secretary is telling her, you can't make sure you note that, because I don't need it not to be noted. And then I say it was approved, and then I can't show it was approved. I need it to be noted. Okay? They give us some examples there. I won't go through all of those. But what I want to get on to as part of governance, risk, and compliance is the whole theory about data protection. We talk about some of it already as well. Like I said, this is a little repetitive. But why has it come more to the forefront in the last year or so? The EU, yes. You know what it is? Do you know what it stands for? It's in your book, actually.
Data protection regulations.
There you go. No, you don't get it.
Oh, she gets it.
Yes.
So I can't get it.
Oh,
Finally.
Thank you.
Yes. So it's the general data protection regulations. And what's interesting about it is the time difference between when it was approved by the EU and when it actually came into effect. Anybody knows the period of time?
1998,
Yes, but do you know when it was approved?
2016.
Yes.
2016.
2016. There you go. 2016. Who had the date that came into effect?
2018, May 25th.
There you go. It must have been. Who else? Who was
Oh.
over here? Hold on.
Do I get credit for 1998? I get credit for 1998? No?
Listen, you're wasting my team. I don't like this way.
That's okay.
You want candy?
No, no, no,
Give them some.
You want candy?
Get the candy and pass it back.
She was.
I bet y'all remember everything we learned here today.
Yes.
Right? Okay, watch. Incentives always help. Right. So, what you'll find with most EU directives and regulations, they give everyone a period of time, right, to get familiar with the legislation or whatever the regulation is that they put in place or directive, so that when they say it becomes effective, you cannot say that you're not prepared. And so there was a whole 2-year almost gap before you saw the implementation of this. And of course, when it came out in the news, it was like, oh man, this has just got passed. And I was like, but this has been around for a while. It's now the implementation is coming on board. Now, what does that mean? Before we go into it, what is the Bahamian equivalent? Anybody? Data protection. Now, who was that? Hold on, everybody putting up their hand.
No, I was saying it was all.
Okay, Data Protection Act. Now, when the Data Protection Act was passed here, there were two other pieces of legislation that was passed with it. Does anybody know what it was?
We did.
When our Data Protection Act was passed, there were two other pieces of legislation that was passed with it.
Consumer something.
No, they correlate, and here's why. So you have the Data Protection Act. Actually, it's called the Data Protection, and then they have the parenthesis, and it says Privacy of Personal Information Act. And actually, the act is dated April 2007, but it actually was assented to in April 2000 and, sorry, I have it the wrong way around. It was passed in 2003. It became effective 2007. That's the thing to remember. See, they gave us a little time. I remember when this came out because everyone was like, ugh, who else has this jurisdiction? By that time, loads of countries had had similar legislation, and we were just being forced. Because once again, we're going to be blacklisted. We need to get off the blacklist. All right? And with that came the two other pieces of legislation, and that was the Computer Misuse Act and the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act, 2000. Both of those are 2003. The reason why they were passed together is because you need the three. You got it? Everybody got it?
No.
Computer Misuse Act and the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act. The three of those were passed together because they, in essence, create the totality of the regime that we need in order to protect personal data.
Sorry, you could repeat the electronic one again.
Electronic Communications and Transactions Act. I had to write it down because I used it on off my head and I didn't remember it.
They create totality, right?
They create the totality of the regime that we needed in order to protect data, personal data. All right? Now, the Computer Misuse Act is where the offense is that the police would go after you for. That's not to say there aren't offenses under the Data Protection Act. And the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act talks about sending information out there. So, in order to be able to cover all of the things that technology brings, they couldn't do it in one act. And the Data Protection Act also set up the Data Protection Commissioner, who you guys should all know who the Data Protection Commissioner is. Anybody?
Michael Wright.
Yes.
Girl, you on a
Listen,
roll.
I gotta watch out for you. All right,
Take
yeah,
your
Michael
whole
Wright.
body.
Yeah, she's a regular anyway.
Does
She should be
anybody
disqualified.
know who the previous Data Protection Commissioner was?
Charmaine. Charmaine.
Farrington Austin.
Austin, yeah.
Yeah, she ran in, was it Andros or something, as an independent, I think, or something like that? I think it was Andros, South Andros, I think. Which is when she ceased to be the data protection because she wanted to run, if I remember correctly. Right? Most people don't know that we have a data protection commissioner. Most people don't even know where they are. Does anybody know where they're located?
I know that, but I know where.
Okay, well, I'll tell you, because they're all in a lovely, nice, new building.
Oh, I know.
Yes, Ponciana House,
They want to see how it's
where UBS, all previously known as UBS House.
Yeah.
You better go on for UBS.
Obviously, don't travel east because there's now a big sign up and it has all of them listed. Anyway, the jobs, the Data Protection Commissioner, part of the Data Protection Commissioner's ambit is to actually educate the public as to the legislation that's out there for the protection of their personal information. 2, to take complaints.
Right.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So,
Take complaints,
to educate the public.
yes, on the protection of their personal information, data. They actually do have a little portion of the government site, you can go on and it tells a little bit about them as well. They also take complaints, and they have, and the Data Protection Commissioner would work with the Commissioner of Police to determine whether or not charges need to be brought against maybe an offender, for example. Let me give you an example. Everybody has known about certain social media things that were out there that maybe we all thought was a little offensive. And you would see that the police got involved. Now, some things the police can get involved directly, and other things, the complaint really should be made to the Data Protection Commissioner, and then they work with the police force to determine whether or not an investigation should be made and whether charges should be brought and what those charges are. All right, so those are things that, yes, we do have going on in the Bahamas. So, we talk about part of your personal data, for example, would be your information when you go to the ATM. Because your ATM card has lots of information about you. And the financial institution that allows persons to go in there and hack it and take your information and use it for their own purposes has now breached the data protection rules, correct? Correct. And they also have to, one, notify you when things like that happen. All right? They can't just, yeah, you, well, you know, I think the most recent largest one has been RBC.
Yeah.
I'm not picking on RBC, but yes, RBC, I don't know how many of their customers, they actually had to cancel the cards. And a lot of them, they canceled just to be sure that the information didn't get out. Because if your money happens to go missing on your account, they are responsible. And part of the Data Protection Act says that they're supposed to have controls and processes in place to prevent that from happening. All right? And so a lot of people couldn't use their ATM cards for quite a while because they had none. It was canceled. And it took some people up to 3 months to get their cards
And their money.
and their money.
My coworkers are waiting on their money now from July last year.
All right? And so the one previous to that was Scotia. A lot of people who were traveling, I think it was during the summer or something like that.
Yeah.
RBC was the same, it was during the summer. Unfortunately, realized that large chunks of their money was missing off their account.
Yeah, but most of the time it's only when the customer comes to the financial institution and be like, oh, something's wrong with my.
Exactly. They don't
Sure.
tell you
What do
nothing.
you call it? You know, because sometimes
The bank may not know.
the bank don't know.
There you go.
So to be honest.
That's exactly.
Even though it's a breach, but sometimes you really
Yes.
don't know how
Could
to.
not know.
But guess what?
Monitoring.
The legislation says that you're supposed to have sufficient safeguards in place. Right?
Just has flag you on, but suspicious transaction should flag if
Yes.
someone hacked the system.
But more so with debit cards and not the regular ATM cards. Because the regular ATM cards are not so safeguard as a Visa debit, you know.
Well, it actually didn't make any difference in both of those cases. And you'll see most people have now moved towards the chip card.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah.
So you put in a PIN,
But even with the chip cards, because that happened to me, when I went away, I used my card, the machine said transaction declined. I never even got to put in the PIN, but the money was off the account.
and you need to talk to your.
No, I talked to them while I was away, but I just trying to figure out what's the point of the PIN if I didn't even put the PIN in, but the money still came off.
Well, bear in mind, a criminal is always one step ahead of everybody,
Yeah.
okay? I mean, the banks aren't the only ones that have had this. I mean, places like Target and Walmart, they've had the same issues. You know, thousands of people, almost billions of people's information is gone. Likewise, I mean, you've had it from the social media sites like Yahoo and you name it. They've all been hacked and people's information went, and you know, how many people get statements online? They have so much information, credit card information comes on a receipt because they bought something online and they got the invoice sent to them electronically. So if I get into your account, your online account, I can learn all sorts of things about you.
Yep.
All right? How does this all work with data protection? That's your personal information that these institutions are supposed to be protecting against getting out there and somebody else having free access to it, free use. Likewise, it's also what procedures do you have in place in your organization? Now, one of the things, let's go back to the EU legislation. EU legislation goes a little further than even our legislation because it says things like, for example, when you put terms and conditions in your terms and conditions that talk about information, you using the client's information. Listen, let's be real. I work for a trust company. We open trust accounts. We have to say who the set land beneficiaries are. We have to provide due diligence on them. I'm going to have to give your information to somebody, correct? Now, it doesn't say that you can't have clauses that will help prevent and protect the financial institution. What it says is that those clauses have to be sufficiently clear for the person to understand, you know, in a concise way, what it is that they're agreeing to. What consent are they giving you? All right? The EU data protection, if you go to the pages, now mine is 185, so yours is 184, I'm assuming.
185 is
What, we're on the same, I don't understand this at all. I can't even tell you why this is happening.
Okay, go.
No, what happened is, you could print the manual in sections, or
Right.
you could print the whole manual. If you print it in sections, the pages are off.
Okay,
As
yeah.
opposed to when you print the whole thing, that's
Okay.
why.
So, it lists there for you some of the interesting things about the EU regulations. And then it talks about the GDPR, right? GDPR. The acronym, you know, we like acronyms in compliance. Proceeds of Crime Act became POCA. The Financial Transaction Reporting Act became the FTRA. We just like acronyms. We like to shorten things. But the key changes there was the increase in territorial scope too. So, our information, our Data Protection Act didn't really look extraterritorial in its presentation. The EU Act really doesn't care where the information is. They're going to hold you, whether you're in an EU jurisdiction or not, responsible if somebody's information goes missing or gets out and you didn't have the controls in place. And so that's why there was such a fuss in 2018 when everybody's talking about this coming into effect, because it's so extraterritorial. All right? Now what's going to be interesting is how are they going to really enforce that? I'm interested to see how that works if you're outside the EU. But, you know, like I said, watch this space. They have penalties there for institutions who don't adhere to the requirements. Now, what's interesting, they actually tell you what the penalty is. And if you remember, look at 185, at the top they have the penalty, and they talk about institutions being fined up to 4% of their annual global turnover. So there goes the bonus. Or 20 million euros, whichever is the greatest. That's a whole lot of money. Now, I think in here they gave an example about somebody in an organization having a laptop that has customer information on it, and it got stolen. You know that company paid for money, right? Now, most of us, we have swipes to get into work. We gotta have a code to get into this. Fingerprints. Facial recognition is becoming the in thing now. They have to show that they have these policies and procedures in place to protect their client information. Now, we have people that travel,
Yes.
right? So they're gonna take a device. What protections do you have on that device to ensure that if it got stolen, some hacker isn't going to get all of your client's information? Now, I have, for example, I have one of these lovely laptops that have more protections on it. I can't even put a jump drive in it because everything, if you put it on that jump drive, becomes automatically encrypted. All right? So you're not going to tell my organization that we didn't have the policies, procedures, controls in place to mitigate against the risk. Because reality is, things are going to get stolen, things are going to get misplaced. We're going to talk about you running to catch a flight and you accidentally left your bag on the plane. That happens. We talked about sending out emails and somebody didn't check to make sure that that extra little letter in there on John's name was the right email address. You fax something, that's one of the examples they give in the book. You fax something, one of the institutions continually fax something to the wrong address. Now, if you keep faxing, somewhere along the line, you would have thought, right, that employee would have been sufficiently trained to say, hold on, let me confirm the number. Let me make sure that you actually got it. All right? I'm not going to continually send it to that same incorrect number. All right? And this is why it's compliance's job to help protect us against these EU penalties, and the penalties under our Data Protection Act requires us to have a controller within our organizations, somebody who has sufficient knowledge and skill. And guess what, compliance is going to have to test all these things too with internal audit, to make sure we have in place those things needed. We have firewalls, we have security training, we've made sure that everybody understands procedures. So if, for example, you take a lot of banks, not only is there signature checks against which you have on file, but there's also callback procedures. You're not just gonna, somebody sent me an email, tell me transfer $10 million somewhere, and I'm not gonna make sure that you actually sent me the email. Right? And what is that wire gonna have? All kind of client information attached to it, right? All right? I know of a case now in the Bahamas where, some professions, unfortunately, mine being one of them, being the legal side, not the compliance side, we don't necessarily think about a lot of the stuff that we think about in the financial services industry, that perhaps maybe if I am acting as a protector or trustee and I get an instruction from a beneficiary to do something, then I might need to do a bit of a callback if they send me an email. And particularly if there is a change in pattern. Monies don't move, and I was saying to you, well, maybe, this money's been sitting here and it isn't making any interest. Maybe we should diversify this and so it get income earning. And then all of a sudden, I start getting all kind of emails from you to say, transfer money here, I'm buying art here. And I don't think to say, hold on, I need to call because this is out of character. You don't think I'm going to be liable? The legislation sure makes me unliable. All right? And these are the things that part of the Data Protection Act is trying to protect against. And these are the things that the EU wants to make sure that we all have in place. All right? So, they talk about once there's a breach, you have to notify. You cannot not tell your client, unfortunately. Gone are those days where you hope that they don't find out, and if they don't find out, all is well. That doesn't happen anymore. So that's why you'll see quite often the financial institutions, particularly the commercial banks that get hacked, you will see they put a notice in the paper because they may not have a chance right away to call you and let you know to check and make sure your account is where it should be. They have to put something in the newspaper and notify the public. Likewise, any financial institution, and notice I'm using the term financial institution loosely because financial institution is wide in terms of its ambit, who it captures. You have to go out there and notify. You can't just hope for the best any longer. All right? And then, of course, internally, you have to have your process and procedures of how are you then going to analyze what happened, right? Because you need to show that, particularly your regulator, how that's not going to happen again. And what controls you put in place to make sure it doesn't happen again. So some of the other things that they talk about is my personal data. I decide to leave your institution, and I'd like to have my data released. I would like to have the information I provided you. So the EU regs say that you have to be able to provide it to me, and you have to be able to provide it to me in a way that I can use that information. So the words they actually use, and I did highlight it, because I thought it was so cute in how they have it. Of course now I can't find it. But they want you to be able to, it to be in a format that, for example, you can put into your computer and you can see that it's there. All right, you can't say, oh, well, we have this special system. Unless you have that program or software, you're not going to actually see that. That's not going to happen. It has to be a common format that we use today, PDF, something like that. I've just given you an example. All right. The Financial Transaction Reporting Act actually goes further than that and to talk about, I think we talked about this last week too, where you have mandatory destruction. All right, and that includes both hard copy and electronic. So all of the Data Protection Act and the rest of these acts still apply to cloud-based information. The fact that we're putting things in the cloud doesn't mean that it's exempt from the laws. It's meant to cover everything. All right? So, there, Mr. First Caribbean customer, I can come on in. I'm moving my account. I'd like to have my information, please. What you gonna do about it? How are you gonna give me my information? Pardon?
You got a friend.
No, I was just saying, in certain circumstances, that still no, like you giving them their paper or the documents doesn't take it out of your system.
Right.
Because certain institutions have system where, like if you have a loan and you pay that out, yeah, you pay that out, but that's forever in our system, so.
Is it?
Yeah,
No.
like we'll see where, no, we'll see, like if you had a loan of $5,000 and you paid it out, we'll see where you had that and you paid it out, the balance is zero, but your KIF still remains with us.
I mean, you can still say
That's
that
in the system.
No.
after a couple
So-
years.
Hold on, here's what is
It's
supposed to happen.
It's supposed to, but like if you go back, say 10 years, you go back to get a loan, they still gonna look in your credit history.
Well, guess what? It sounds like,
Exactly.
now
So
see,
we're
there's
not
certain
going-
exceptions, there are some exceptions, but I will tell you that the Financial Transaction Reporting Act basically says that it's an offense, it's mandatory, you have to destroy.
Exactly.
After a particular time, if there aren't the exceptions. Part of the exception, they may still have a relationship with you, and you need that in order to fulfill the other requirements of the legislation. Verification of identification, for example. You need to verify your customer, so you can't destroy that information, could you? there are hold on.
No, I'm just thinking, so when this credit bureau comes on board.
Exactly.
That's
another
like
thing.
amend legislation or like.
That's exactly.
That's
Yeah,
what, that's the
like a
whole
gesture.
purpose of that, right?
Now, wait now. The credit bureau information isn't really looking at, it's assessing more in terms of information on your credit history as opposed to more of your
KYC.
KYC, that kind of
More
information.
than us.
Yes, your credit worthiness as opposed to, personal
Well, you still
information.
need
That
the
still has
same
personal
information.
information, but with that, the implementation of the credit bureau would come in also and, policies, regulations as to how that information has to be secured and kept and how long it can be kept and all the rest of that. It doesn't just, okay, we're gonna create a credit bureau and that's the end of it. If that was the case, they would have been implemented a long time. You have to look at all of these things.
Legislation as well.
Yes.
So if it's more so on the side of like the KYC, how would they get this credit information? She wants to know.
No, because this is what, my question was, okay, because under the FTRA, after a certain amount of time, we have to purge information or destroy it or whatever. So when the credit bureau comes into play, what will happen
I'm
with
sure
those types of
there will be an
information?
exception to say that, certain information as relates to your credit history can be kept within certain parameters. All right? Otherwise, how are they gonna know what your credit rating is? Right?
So they will have to go back and amend the legislation then.
Well, I doubt they're gonna be able to go back and amend it because this was to get us off a certain, CFATF and the rest of those lists. So credit bureau legislation will have to fall in line with it. I don't think it's going to somehow be so different that it's so out of line, and that's not gonna be accepted. Bear in mind that credit bureau information is also going to have to be looked at it by CFATF too. So it isn't like it's gonna be an imbalance, it will be brought into line.
So back to this point though,
Yes.
so. in
So it
terms
sounds
of-
like your organization has to look at the legislation and determine
But
for
we're not
itself.
behaving on, so that'll be another conversation, that's what I'm asking you. So in
Well,
terms
it
of
doesn't
that-
matter whether they're behaving on or not.
No, but what I mean is in terms of that.
They're
right,
licensed in
because
this
we're not-
jurisdiction.
Right, but we're not the only ones that have that, so what I'm saying is, we're giving you back a paper document, right? Or whatever document you supply to us. But as they said,
It
like you
doesn't have
have
to be
years to
paper,
purge.
remember now, you're supposed to be able to give it in a format back to that person.
No, I understand that,
Okay.
whatever format that is, we're giving that back to you, right?
Yes.
That's fine, fair enough. What I'm talking about is the systems that we operate on a daily basis. They contain these information, so a normal person just can't go and delete that out of the system. So again, after years, either they purge, or what are we gonna do? We need to act to say, hey, y'all gotta delete
Okay.
X, Y, and
Let
Z.
me help you solve this problem. Every financial institution has to have a records management and destruction policy.
Yes, that's for physical documents, I'm
No,
not
no,
talking
no.
about that.
It does not include just physical document. It includes your electronic information.
Yeah, we don't have no person to go delete. So, I know, I just saying.
Well, hopefully you all aren't regulated by the central bank because they do ask me that and they ask for my policy. And the EU
That's what I was
Yeah.
asking the question, if you have that policy, is it being implemented?
and the
Do
Data
we know
Protection
that?
Act and yes, the FTRA, the Computer Misuse Act, for example, there's a whole bunch of legislation in the Bahamas.
But are we following it?
Is your company
Well,
following
you
it?
should be following it.
I mean, we're compliant as possible, I mean, what I'm saying is that we're not the only ones.
No, sis.
There are other companies as well that have these systems to store these information,
Well, I will,
particularly Canadian banks.
yeah, well, that might be, anyway, I won't say what I was gonna say. Maybe why I think Canadian banks are on the way out, but anyway, that's my personal opinion.
Still operating here.
What I wanna say is that, I think you will find that from a regulatory perspective, you will find that if you didn't get it on your last inspection, when they come in on the next inspection, they're gonna ask you those very questions. Particularly as we now have it enshrined in legislation. And particularly as we are really trying to get on the good side of CFATF, amongst other organizations. All right? And so, yes, I mean, there are exceptions to you keeping that information, obviously. Right? There may be some litigation that's involved. You wouldn't be destroying that information, would you? All right?
And then also too, some companies, they go beyond legislation. They have it
Yes.
for a longer period of time, they get information. So maybe you're buying one for 7 or 10 years instead of the designated time.
Bear in mind, if you don't have it in policy and you cannot justify your policy against the legislation, you're gonna be in trouble with your regulator. And you could be in trouble with your client, particularly if they are foreign clients. You know, in the Bahamas, we don't tend to, unfortunately, we're not at that stage, our public, to the point where we'll go and ask for our information back, or we wanna know what your destruction policy is. We don't ask, we technically don't ask those type of policies, or questions, I should say. But that's the reality. And from a group level, I would be surprised if that isn't something that isn't already on the focus of the necessary persons within your organization. And if it isn't, it soon will be. I can tell you that much. Okay? Because actually in Canada, for all those Canadian banks that are out there, there was a court ruling in the last month or so that talked about this whole thing. And so Canadian banks, you will see, if they haven't already realized the mess that they have themselves in, you'll see a movement towards correcting the problem. All right, because most of your stuff comes from the head office down. And one of the things I want to tell you what the legislation says, they don't really care what your parent, you may be part of a group, but you have to adhere to the regulatory requirement here and the legislative requirement here. And so, you know, if the group says, and this is one of the things that's the legal and compliance, you have to work together and make sure it's clear that in my jurisdiction, I cannot keep that document for that long. I'm sorry.
And they might take the database and transfer it somewhere else.
Yeah.
They could do it.
Which is probably what they're gonna do.
That's why I didn't print it out.
All right?
All
Okay.
Bahamas information printed out.
And Jamaica.
You're right, and
Everybody.
Jamaica.
And Jamaica.
That's why they don't like law no more.
In Jamaica.
You know, one of the centers that they used to do, well, a lot of companies, a lot of big companies, they would send the information to Luxembourg. But Luxembourg, unfortunately, because of pressure, has had to make adjustments themselves recently. So a lot of people that transfer the information, they're thinking, okay, we can store it there and it's gonna be fine. Now realizing, oh shoot, now that, I mean, when I was with the Swiss banks, that was the thing, you know, let's move everything to Luxembourg and we're gonna set up a branch there and we're gonna house all the information there and servers. Everything catches up. It's always a matter of time. You're only moving ahead as fast as the wheels of progress is catching up with you. That's what I always tell people, remember that. All right, so they tell you about making sure that, and that's under the right to be forgotten. Don't ask me why it's like that, but wouldn't it be easy to just say the right to have information erased or whatever, but the right to be forgotten. All right. The words that I was looking for, see it right here. It has to be in a format that is commonly used and machine readable format. When I ask for my information back, it has to be in a format that is commonly used and machine readable. So I can't give you something that you can't go in to make sure that that's your information from something that a device that you have that. And most people, you know, the Microsoft Word is out there. Adobe. If it can't fit in one of those things, more than likely most people can't. Their system won't be able to read it. I mean, that's the reality. Okay? And then they talk about making sure that when you pass information on, you only pass on what's needed to other persons like myself who are trustees and we have to set up these accounts, we're not giving them everything. We're only giving what is needed to get what we have the goal that we're trying to reach. We don't just get, oh, here's everything. That's just not gonna work, is it? All right, and so they talk about data minimization. I like these terms that they have, but anyway. Everybody should have a data processing officer in their organization. Our Data Protection Act calls for it with the controller. He's the persons with knowledge and skill. They're gonna make sure that that information is all protected and we're doing what we're supposed to. You looking for us?
You said data minimization.
Yeah.
Everybody need to have a data what? Data
Yeah,
protection.
Yes.
Okay.
We're at 186 on the privacy by design.
187, the print something?
Yeah.
Is it going off again?
Yeah.
We good though, we have
I see
different
privacy
pages.
by design, but then.
Um,
Oh,
Okay. So, note some of the examples I gave there. We taught, the one with the laptop was Nationwide Bank. Their laptop was stolen. Note the fine that they got. They gave an example of Zurich Insurance PLC, and that was the loss of confidential customer data. They also gave you the example of Bank of Scotland, who got fined £75,000. That was the one where the person kept faxing the information to the wrong person and couldn't figure it out. All right. And then they talked about the Hilton Group. All right. And bear in mind that so many organizations, you go into a hotel all the time and you don't think about the fact that you swipe your data and they keep the information in their system. And you swipe your credit card, they keep the data around. Somebody goes and hack it.
how do you feel about shredding things and then putting customer information in there and then you call it shredding company to come to shred it, but nobody really watching them other than.
No, they supposed to
Okay.
watch it. We have somebody.
Hold on now.
I'm asking, I don't know this right type of thing.
You asked
I'm not
my
talking-
view.
I'm not saying
Okay,
Alpha,
let's-
which one I'm just No, I'm not saying Alpha, I'm just saying, I'm just asking.
A lot of people use, what's the shredding company called?
Sunrise. Everybody uses that.
Everything is getting.
Bear in mind that, and I think there was a case, and I can't remember, I think it was McKinney background, and Hughes had some, I think the US government was watching them, and they went through their trash, and they were able to get some of the information that they were trying to get from McKinney, and then they went in and posed as someone, and no one realized. All right? But bear in mind, you have people that will take, shredding can be done in a lot of different ways. First of all, customer information should never, you always should have policy on how information is disclosed. It has customer data on it. I mean, you're not gonna just throw it in the garbage bin and then the cleaning lady comes by and wraps it all up and put it in the garbage bin. Is it?
Dogs coming there.
You understand?
It's all over the street.
Flying God! You understand? And the same applies for your personal data. Your records at home. You shouldn't just take them and throw them in the garbage tin for the sanitation worker to come by, and next thing you see that flying around too.
Yeah.
Or somebody goes to the dump and they walk in through and they open the bag, because it's only gonna be sitting there, nothing's gonna happen to it unless there happens to be a fire at the dump. Right? And hopefully that got burnt in the fire, you know what I mean? But your policies and procedures should talk about how you dispose of client data. Anything with client information on it. And you have to look into things, and compliance, I had to learn about all this stuff, the different ways that you can shred information. Because there are people who will sit down and take a bag of shredding.
Put them together like
I was
puzzle.
just-
See.
Just say that.
You understand?
Say you know if it whole or not.
So there are different types of shredding machines. You know, you want it to be shred finely. You don't want it to be shred in strips where people could actually put it back together. You know, or you may even take, some institutions go further than that. If you shred it, it still gets burnt. You know, and Sunrise comes to your institution because you contracted with them. They shouldn't just be taking that stuff out of your institution and shredding it there and nobody's there to watch. How is it taken out, where, and it's actually being shredded? Where is it being put? How is it being disposed of? You're supposed to know all of that. You have no excuse if customer data gets lost that way because you didn't have the controls in place. Those are real examples. Even back in the day when you had these discs, you know how hard it is to destroy one of those discs? But there are ways to destroy those. Likewise, there are ways to destroy information in the cloud. And there's ways to destroy things on your server. If a server dies, and this is part of it. I mean, part of the whole thing of compliance and audit. One of your servers die and you replace it. How do you know somebody can't come back and open that up and still get that information? How is it being disposed? You have to have things in place to make sure that it's being disposed properly. Because if the information gets out that way, not only may you suffer regulatory fines and penalties, but you may have a big lawsuit that you now have to go and defend yourself to say how that information got out. All right? Even with backups, we talk about BCP plans, business contingency plans, and we put our information somewhere else so that we can, if there's a tsunami hit or hurricanes wipe us out, whatever, we can get back up and running, but you have to make sure that information, wherever you have it stored, can't then be utilized by someone else. Because that's client personal information, isn't it? So part of compliance job is sitting on the team that looks at all of this and work out the risks. We cloud-base our system. We have backup. I have to make sure that everything that goes out, when our information is backed up, it's encrypted and stays encrypted. When it comes back in, if we have to get it back, we unencrypt it, not whoever the storage person is. I mean, these are all things that you have to learn and consider. And the EU legislation and our own legislation requires you to do that in your organizations. So, that in a nutshell was all I did about data protection. And they talk about other types of data protection. We have other ways that data is protected in the Bahamas. What's other legislation that can be used to stop me giving you a client information? Now, every person who works in a financial institution should know this one. Yes. What legislation does that relate to? And everybody should know the section if you work in a financial institution. Section 19 of the Banks and Trust Companies Regulations Act. Right? That has been in place for how long? That is how we got the name of being what? What kind of jurisdiction? Yeah, secrecy jurisdiction. Secrecy jurisdiction. I mean, before we had data protection laws, we had secrecy or confidentiality legislation. We had the common law principles we talked about in the Ternier case, right? Tells you when you can give out client information. Ternier. Okay, we'll talk about that later. Okay, so y'all remember Ternier, the Ternier case? Like in England? Set up certain common law principles where you can disclose customer information. Okay. It's actually in your book. Let me see where it is.
You can lower this down.
Where I put it? Where I put it. Hold on. It's actually, hold on. I don't remember where it is in here. They actually, and they always mention it in the ICA manuals. It's at the page of 188. Is that?
6.2.1.
Yes. 6.2.1 talks about client confidentiality.
Find the page.
In my print, it's 188. It's at the top of my page, and it starts in a paragraph that says the rules governing client confidentiality differs between jurisdictions. And it talks about in jurisdictions with no bank secrecy legislation, the rules are likely to be virtually identical to the rules in the UK as laid down as early as 1924 in the case of Turnier and the National Provincial and Union Bank of England. Right? And didn't we talk about those very things last week? Oh, was it paying attention last week? I should have brought my candy last week.
What the question is, I might not know.
Last week, remember, we talked about Turnier establishing when client information can be, customer banker information can be disclosed. And we talked about where the disclosure is under compulsion of law, public
Consent.
disclosure. Yeah, you give your consent, whether it's, yes. And it's either gonna be, your consent is either gonna be expressed or implied. And I told you guys to make sure, if you get the consent, make sure you get it in writing. Don't go with the fact that you may have your telephone system recording everything. Or the fact that you happen to note it down and then you gotta find a piece of paper later. All right? So before you had all the legislation, you had Turnier. And then we got the Banks and Trust Companies Regulations Act. There again, it tells you when you can, and everybody works in a financial institution signs a confidentiality waiver, don't they?
Yeah.
And you have to do, and they go back and they ask you to sign it annually. Some may not do it annually, some may do it every couple of years. But in every training that you do, they remind you. Correct? So, before the Data Protection Act, and even after the Data Protection Act, we still have Section 19. Right? So we have legislation in place. It's just that people like Switzerland made it bad for the rest of the world. How so? Because Switzerland was famous for having, and this is where we went and we go into governance, risk, and compliance. They used to have, you can have a numbered account and they have no information on who you are. You just was number 2560. Or you had an account under a pseudonym. I'm Black Jack. Heck, it's Black Jack. You understand? And Switzerland, unfortunately, got done in. One of the biggest companies that went bankrupt as a result of that is called Magellan. It starts with W, it doesn't sound like it when you say it. It was a Swiss bank. Some of us who have been in the financial services industry long enough would have known of it because the Swiss banks and most of the other financial institutions used to deal with Magellan. And they got done in by the lovely U.S. Department of Justice. They like to find everybody. The worst thing is, don't have any kind of presence in the United States. That's the best thing. All right, because if you have a presence in the United States, they will get you somehow.
Correspondent banking.
The problem with the world today is most everything that deals with correspondent banking is going to go through the U.S. Because what's the currency that we deal with most?
That's the world trade currency.
So guess what? Everything is going to go through a U.S. correspondent bank.
Yep.
All right? So you can't get around it. And so Magellan got caught for actually, and they admitted to helping U.S. persons not only hide and not declare, and they went further than not declare. I mean, well, not declare means they're not just avoiding because they went through loopholes in the U.S. tax law. They outrightly evaded U.S. taxes. All right, and they actually talk about Magellan in here. All right, and so part of secrecy. So after Switzerland got dumped in UBS, Credit Suisse. I don't know if y'all remember UBS was in the news because it established some 300 or 800, I think it was 800 IBCs here in the Bahamas, right? And when UBS was being investigated by the Department of Justice, they could track the records where senior management had decided to divert certain accounts through setting up IBCs here and its operation here. And that came out in the press. So they outrightly assisted to the point where they used to take cash. Private bankers used to take a nice briefcase full of cash, go across. Of course, we didn't have TSA back then, right? TSA would have picked up the cash, we hope, provided they weren't on furlough. We're talking Trump here, if the airports are backed up, not only because of snow and other winter conditions, but because of the shutdown, the federal shutdown, correct? So, all of these things, I talk about secrecy because there is always some kind of information in place. So whilst everybody, it's very rare to find anywhere in the world where there isn't data protection legislation. But when there isn't data protection, there's always some legislation there that provides for the protection of customer information. That's what they really wanted you to get out of this unit, I should say. All right? So, they talk about designing systems and implementation, right? Y'all ready to go ahead?
You told us to only read from one page to one page.
Pardon?
Technically, you said to read from page so and so.
To 189.
To 189.
Okay, y'all want me to stop at 189?
No,
She passed the
she
189.
put 189, we on 190.
Yes, we are on 190.
Signing
You can tell I enjoy my subject.
Just because you finish reading the chapter, Brian, don't show off, okay?
Just bring it up, but it's on 189.
Well, then y'all can catch up. I'm gonna talk more about examples. These are interesting things that y'all will read about for next week. And y'all will be caught up with me. And guess what, when you go through these, you'll understand what I'm talking about. So, when we talk about implementation, we talk about governance, risk, and compliance. Now, one of the things I don't like about this unit is that they talk about implementation, and then they gave you the examples of why we got to where we are in terms of implementation, which I think they should have started it the other way. How do we get to governance, risk, and compliance? We had a whole series of events that happened that got us from a global perspective of governance, risk, and compliance. All right? And they have a couple of them listed there. Most people remember Enron. All right? If you haven't heard about Enron, Enron was the company that everybody wanted to work for. Enron was a combination of two U.S. conglomerates that came together. And they did all sorts of interesting things. They had Enron Online. They did trading of derivatives and all sorts of unique securities products and stuff like that. They were the guys that you would see, and they're driving around in the fancy cars, and they go to lunch at the most expensive places, and everybody wanted to buy shares at Enron because for years their shares were deemed, this company was deemed to be producing the best results ever. And then you had a series of things that happened. They got rid of a CEO and hired a new one. And within 6 months, the guy resigned. And then they put the CEO that they had gotten rid of back as the CEO. So of course the SEC is like, no, hold on a minute here. Something's not right. And then it's just odd that it's too good to be true. It usually is too good to be true. They were always getting the best returns. We started to, the financial crisis started to happen, and they were still doing well. And so the SEC decided to investigate them, and after they finished this investigation, they realized that they were cooking the books. They weren't outrightly, they were outrightly lying, omitting things from financial statements. When regulators came in, they just didn't tell them everything that they needed to know. And what became clear with Enron is the need for regulatory oversight, greater regulatory oversight of companies worldwide. And to hold the persons responsible, like the board. Because of course the people at the top at Enron would say, well, they didn't know all of this was happening. All right? And what became clear too is when they investigated, they had no systems of control in place to make sure that the very things that was happening did not happen. After that, you had Bernie Madoff. All right? JP Morgan got done in because why? 2013, they were the primary bank for Bernie Madoff and the Madoff Fund. Every financial institution in the Bahamas had a client invested in one of the Madoff funds. Everybody, well, a lot of us still have accounts that still have those investments because nothing can be done. All right? Now, for those of you who don't know about Bernie Madoff, I thought everybody knew about Bernie. Bernie was living their life. Bernie Madoff was the largest Ponzi scheme ever. It went on for somewhere between 10 and 30 years. And as you know, with Ponzi schemes, you have to keep, that's hard work. You got to keep people coming in order to keep that going. But he was able to successfully do that. And JP Morgan was his primary banker. And the regulators wanted to know, how is it that you did not know? Because JP Morgan did not have the policies and monitoring processes in place to monitor his account. It could be that they just wasn't interested because, even in the financial crisis, and this is what cracked me up, right? With some of the most experienced brokers out there, right? You're in a financial crisis and this one, all of his funds were doing well. Everybody else is tanking, but his is doing well, and you telling your client to invest in it. And you didn't think that was funny? Too good to be true, right? You should have known. That's why JP Morgan, they actually have the fine that JP Morgan got in here, which I thought was quite interesting. Do we have JP Morgan fine?
Yes.
Yes.
That's on page 191.
181.
Trying to see.
Is it?
Yes. They got they got a cease and desist order. But Bernie Madoff Fund actually was worth, defrauded people out of $19.5 billion. And they're still trying, the litigations is still going on to try and get some of that money back for those people who invested. And guess what? Bernie Madoff family still have some of that. They didn't have unexplained wealth orders back then. So some of his family members still have some of that wealth. All right? What they don't talk about here, I thought was interesting, was WorldCom. That was another one that cost us to get, to a governance, risk, and compliance regime. They talk about Barings Bank. They also talk about Society Generale, which everybody knows as SG. And actually, I met one of these guys, and this was the guy from UBS that they have in here. And his name was, Kiko Adaboli. He went to jail for 3 years in the UK. And of course now, he's actually out making a big profit of selling his book. But there again, look at how the controls weren't in place. In that situation in UBS, he was a young trader coming in. And UBS moved people, he was working out of London, and they moved people about. And he tells the story quite effectively too, whereby he got promoted very quickly. Why? Because they were moving senior management around, and then he realized they didn't have people in place to fill the role of manager or whoever in that particular area to which he was in. And he didn't have much experience. I mean, he was a young trader, but he didn't have the experience that a manager needed. He didn't have all of the know-how and skills that we talked about just from a compliance perspective. And they put him in charge of this very lucrative, very demanding, very risky area. And he'll tell you he didn't know what the hell he was doing. But he's getting paid good. All right? And when clients start to lose their money because you invest in them in very risky securities and you don't understand the risks, then that's only when they start to lose the money. Now, once they make money, you don't hear nothing. But once they start losing the money, the regulatory body gets advised, and that's how UBS got fined. And when they went and they realized there was nobody who controlled what this young man was doing. The board, nobody, they didn't know from a day-to-day basis what his exposure was in his department. They didn't know, in essence, to make it simple, how much losses that he was making at any given time. And we're talking UBS. Now, I worked for UBS some years ago, and they used to give us a rough time in the Bahamas. So you got to wonder, right? How is it that nobody was monitoring his department? And there again, we talked that term becomes up too big to fail. That's really what it was. This is UBS. Of course we know what's going on. And so we get to governance, risk, and compliance. You can't say, dear board, that you did not know. How could you let that young man be running that whole department with so little experience? And you talking high net worth clients. They ain't dealing with a couple $1,000s here and there. You're dealing with millions on a day-to-day basis. You're trading these clients' money. Nobody was looking to see that did his investments meet the client's profile, for example. All right? Was he going a little too risky for the profile that the client signed up with UBS for? Who was looking at it? Nobody. Like I said, nobody's looking at what the exposure on a day-to-day basis was. And it's companies like this. Volkswagen was the greatest one, though. They have Volkswagen in there. Volkswagen was the one where the CEO didn't even know that they had falsified testing results and other things with regard to their the diesel vehicles that they were putting out in terms of emissions and other things. The CEO don't know what's going on in his own company. And he was quite happy to say he didn't know.
You figure that person's shocked.
Of course. And that's why you now see that we have these provisions in our legislation. This is, guess what? If Volkswagen, if Enron, if JP Morgan are going to that company commits the offense, then who are the persons who should have been in the organization to make sure the offense didn't happen? Y'all are going to be held liable. That's part of governance, risk, and compliance. This is why compliance has to sit down and help the board to create that framework that risk framework. That doesn't mean that we do the, like I said, the whole job. We got other departments. In the big places, they have a whole credit risk department, for example. My organization, we don't have a credit risk department. You know, there will be departments like internal audit. There will be HR has to do HR's function to make sure that we're getting employees in for the job that has the knowledge, experience. They haven't been locked up for stealing client money. You know, these type of things. They have to be, it has to be other people in the organization to help with those controls. We talked about, good night. We talked about induction, training. When you come into an organization, HR is supposed to have as part of your control listing, a list, new persons coming in. How are they gonna learn your policies and procedures? Are they going to compliance to figure out, I can't assume because you've been in financial services for a number of years, that you need, I need you to be in my organization for compliance purposes. You're coming from a big company, I assume that you're up to scratch? No. Right? That induction program that we talked about, that should be on the HR list to make sure that, and you know what, my regulator looks at how am I making sure that when persons come into my organization, they're aware of policies, procedures, the controls, they are knowledgeable about safety issues, that includes data protection and other things. All right? All of that goes to governance, risk, and compliance. So all of those departments should be helping with your institution's governance, risk, and compliance. And all of those departments should, if there isn't, I mean, big organizations like First Caribbean, they all probably have committees that these persons report to. And they're board committees, because there's probably a couple board members that sit on that. And not only are those board members supposed to be intimately involved in terms of knowledge, because you're sending that information up. All right? But that information continues to go to the whole board, so that no director should be able to say, I didn't know that this was a gap in my organization. All right? One of the things that they have, you'll find out in one of these pages as you go along, they have some interesting terminology that they talk about the role of the compliance officer. And they talk about 6 functions that the compliance officer needs to do. And it talks about identification, evaluation, implementation, prevention, monitoring, detection, escalation, resolution, regular advice, and review. All right, and that's actually page 193. But the thing is to remember that the compliance role plays a major function in helping the board. We're not taking over that function for the board. The board still has to know. We're helping them. All right? We're helping them to identify gaps. Internal audit then supposed to come back and check to make sure all those things that we're putting in place, are we really controlling it? So it isn't just compliance that internal audit should be checking. It's HR, it's operations, it's accounting. It's how whatever departments you have, those controls need to be placed. They have to go through your organization. That's really what governance, risk, and compliance is all about. All right, no matter how big the organization is, like I said, if you're under-resourced, what you're supposed to be doing, your board's supposed to know. If you can't train everybody, your board should not be saying, I didn't know that we couldn't train everybody. Like I said, I train everybody from the receptionist to the messenger, up to the board, to the chairman. Nobody could say they don't know in my organization. And I have to be able.
You being serious?
I'm being serious.
Put it down.
She said that last week, would you wanna pay attention?
No, he wasn't
I
paying.
was
I
paying
also need to take some of this candy back.
Yes.
Sticking his
Yeah. No, I remember you saying it last week, but I just thought it was just like you just using it as an
No,
example.
no.
Everybody gets trained, because guess what? I may ask you to take my messenger, to take client information somewhere. If you don't understand the risks that one, we have certain regulatory and legal regulations to make sure that that information gets secure. So you don't go and you have it in the car that you're delivering and you leave the door, the window open and you jump out, oh, I only get it for a couple of minutes. And somebody just comes in and swipe that information.
You make a little pit stop.
Or,
Because sometimes you outsource some of these messengers as well, they're not even internal.
no, but compliance, part of that whole process, you're supposed to have, we talked about sunrise shredding. You're supposed to have a process of evaluation to determine what your risks are if you take on that external service provider. Right? Remember now, even, I don't know, under the central bank, certain things that I outsource, I have to get central bank approval. All right? Now, sunrise shredding, I may not have to get approval. I'm just saying. Right? But let me give you an example. A lot of people, small organizations, they don't do all their IT work. They hire a company that assists them with the IT. That is a function that needs to be approved if you're licensed by the central bank as an outsourced function. And compliance and legal are supposed to make sure that all the things are in place in accordance with the guidelines that the regulatory body has set up. So when you go to the central bank, you get your approval to outsource it. Right? So even certain janitorial companies, a lot of financial institutions don't have an in-house janitor that deals with that, and they hire an external service provider. You have to be sure that Mr. Man who come in to take the garbage and see all this client information and just don't dump it in the garbage and it ends up going down the road and blowing on somebody's windshield. All right? Because you're still gonna be liable either way. Right? So, no, I wasn't joking, because the receptionist can be easily, if the receptionist doesn't understand the risks, somebody could come and ask questions and she can inadvertently, or he or whoever it is, can inadvertently give customer information out that they're not supposed to. And if they don't know that they're doing that, whose responsibility is that? Yeah. All right? Gone are the days where we say we don't know. I didn't train because we don't have enough hours in the day.
Hey,
You gotta find the hours.
And you have a whole year to train, so you gotta find sometime in that whole year.
Yes.
Everybody's in the same training, the messengers in the training as the other staff.
Now, some of it I may tailor compared to depending on the function. I mean, they talk about that too in the unit. You may tailor it because, you know, where it comes to legislation, I train everybody. Everybody gets the same training. All right? Now, as it may come to certain other things, I try to train everybody on everything, because there are times when I cannot foresee some of the things that's gonna happen, and things happen. And the lady that I talked about last week, who remembers my Curious George, she's actually on our, on the bank account side, not client accounting. So she's dealing with the bank's books as opposed to the client's books, like in terms of, she's not doing financials for our client entities. Yeah, she's more on operations. But she's the one who remembered, because I wanted to make sure everybody understood. Particularly things like, how are they gonna pick up if something is suspicious? For what happens at every level of your institution. It doesn't just happen at one level. and people are inadvertently caught up in fraud, and the legislation says everybody has to report a suspicious transaction, right? And know how to report it within your organization. How do you escalate it up? What are the internal procedures for reporting? And if you're caught up in a situation where you don't know or you can't report it internally, that you can go and report it yourself. The new legislation didn't do away with that. They just called it something else. That's all. They just gave it a nice name. Okay? So. Anyway, y'all ready to go? I can see that. All right, so listen. Let me just make sure y'all read these pages before you go. Make sure you know the pages. So where did I tell y'all? Y'all didn't get to.
Responsibility, rules and responsibilities.
That's 193.
192.
Okay, so if y'all read 2, so the next week we could talk about your assignment.
All right, all right, all right.
So if you guys read 2,
No, go, don't stay.
200, is that good?
Yeah.
200?
200. 200. Read up to 200.
Yes, read up to page 200. I know
And
it's
then
late.
go from
It's late. You had a
172.
hard day
What you gonna do?
up to page
Very
200.
rough day.
Well, the equivalent of my 200.
Yeah.
So that means start from 172 and work your way
Man,
up.
we must people talking. That's true.
All right?
I need more candy next time.
No, I think you had too much candy.
No, I didn't eat all of them.
All right, so listen. Any questions? Feel free. I'm at Private Trust. Give me a call. Private Trust Corporation Limited,
Where's Practice located?
Charlotte House, 2nd floor.
Right now.
She didn't say come in and talk to her. She didn't say come in and talk to her.
She said she opened her
She
open
said
door.
all-
She said compliance should have an open door. That's what she said.
People don't work there. You don't work there.
Kept walking. I can see.
Yeah, they are too much
Yes,
Next time only one.
One, yes, all right.
She
You
said
don't work
compliance.
there?
She said
You don't
compliance
work
open
there?
door.
You don't work there. I don't
No,
apply.
wait, you need to know that.
Security.
Which one is yours?
Only one say first Caribbean.
No, I ain't right, I ain't right.
I don't think so,
He's the
Why was the wrong like
why you gonna take your name?
I don't know. I should have been in the proper place to let's go jail.
The raw light board. They call you anytime.
Listen, I was president of BACO and people still just call me all the time to ask me, well, what do you think about it? What
I
should I
think that's
do?
where I saw you before.
Probably.
My back. I think
I've
you went
been
to
in
something
with
at
Baco
Hilton.
From its inception.
Because when I first went into compliance in 2015, I came to back.
Oh, you wanna tell them no more?
Shush.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I was seeing you
Yeah.
at the Hilton.
You ain't say you can tell them.
I still on the tell. Okay, I'll call you. Alright. See you later. Enjoy your night.
You wouldn't even say walk me to the first door.
I invite you though.
What type of friendship this is? I what's running away. I don't wanna go home.
Anyway, one of the, you all group here, remember as part of your assignment, they want you to, you have to actually state, when you put your paper there,